Hello and welcome back to Clinical Trialblazers, a podcast by Biotech, where we explore the human stories behind breakthrough clinical research. I am your host, Alberto Grignolo, and we're excited to kick off Season 2. Today's guest is Paul Garofolo, the co-founder and chief executive officer of Locus Biosciences, a biotechnology company focused on the discovery and development of a next-generation platform for programmed cell death. We'll get more into the science of this in our conversation. Paul's journey to CEO reflects the rare blend of technical training and enterprise-scale operational leadership. Prior to founding Locus, he spent many years at Patheon Pharmaceuticals, where he served in a number of high-profile roles, including Chief Technology Officer and Global Head of Operations for Pharmaceutical Development Services. At Patheon, he led global organizations spanning development, manufacturing, and technology transformation, experiences that continue to shape his views on scalability, capital efficiency, and disciplined execution. Paul is trained in management information systems, and he brings a systems-oriented mindset to his work, whether he is building first-in-class platforms, raising capital across market cycles, or making hard prioritization decisions. Paul joins us today to explore the human and strategic dimensions of funding, focus, and execution in biotech. Paul, thank you very much for being with us, and thank you for joining us today for this conversation.
Thank you, Alberto. It's a pleasure to be here.
Let me start with the first question. Looking back at your early technical and operational career, what experiences do you think have shaped how you think today about capital efficiency and resource prioritization as a CEO?
I learned over a couple of decades that having centralized planning, but implementing in decentralized ways, just led to a huge pickup in both speed and adoption. And so I carried that across. That was definitely one of the core tenets that I think carried from one environment to the other. That certainly sits behind one of my big beliefs in running a company, which is time kills programs. And so that we learned very well in large pharma. Certainly, the longer and more expensive your improvement or transformation program, the higher the probability it would eventually be killed. That is no different in the smaller company environment. The longer you stretch out your execution, without question, the higher the risk profile that you're not going to get it to the clinic or you're not going to be able to get the data that you need. And so execution really should be divided down into a series of smaller steps to be able to get not only quick wins, but really sort of build on sort of a stepping stone philosophy of getting to the data that you need.
Patheon is a very large global organization. Locus, I guess, is only US-based?
We have one facility in Research Triangle Park in North Carolina. Almost all of our headcount are here. We do have a global trial environment, at least from a services provider with you guys. So our scope is essentially domestic.
So did you have to downsize mentally from going from a large multinational organization to a local US-based organization in some way? How did your thinking change?
I think the early days of creating this startup, it actually was quite helpful to have that multinational experience. When you're really negotiating the technology licenses that you're going to start the company with, and really when you start going into creating deals, large deals, either with strategic pharmas or government entities, that experience was quite valuable. Understanding the differences between regions, knowing how royalties / let's say sub fees, that these types of things were very helpful to take from one environment to the other.
First-time biotech founders that do not have the kind of global company experience that you brought into Locus, what would you say to them based on the lessons you've learned from having been in that large environment and now being in a smaller environment?
I think in the early days of Locus, and Locus is 10 years old now, you had sort of a pre-COVID set of experiences that are really, I think, old now. There's now new lessons that are sort of post-COVID. We actually are in the infectious disease arena, and that particular therapeutic area has just been decimated, really, Alberto. I mean, the overwhelming majority of strategics were in it when we started Locus and exited at least 2 years before COVID. COVID saw an inflection of interest in our industry as well as infectious disease. So we rode that one. That tide has somewhat changed, obviously, as of the last couple of years. But I think the number of people that are still deep in the clinic has been reduced to essentially just a few of us.
Paul, let me get into a little bit of your decision-making techniques. You've led large organizations, large global operations, and now you're an emerging precision medicine company. I know a decade in the business, but still, perhaps, allow me to say, still emerging. What was the most difficult mindset shift when you moved from optimizing resources at scale, on a global scale, to making perhaps existential funding decisions at a smaller place like Locus?
I think as a leader, you have some core tenets of sort of what you believe is really needed. I would say the environment of working with 10,000 people has a lot more variety and complexity of what each person's role is in that organization to be successful. When you shift to a smaller, much more heavily science-oriented and research and development-oriented company, the employee base is a different animal to manage, and I think that requires a much better concentration on having a compelling purpose, especially in a startup environment where you're not necessarily in a position to compete with, let's say, people working for Google or Apple or, even Merck or, AbbVie, take your pick. I think that the purpose of what you're trying to do is incredibly important, but as well, what work you ask people to do is incredibly important. And there are much, I think, greater opportunities in a smaller company to shift truly meaningful work down to younger employees. And that's, at least for most that you sort of work with, is highly motivational, because you're working on something that could potentially change the world, and you're getting an opportunity to work on complex activities that nobody else would ever dream of giving you in a larger organization. And that requires a lot more focus on execution and a lot more oversight. And, you have to be able and willing to deal with mistakes, but find them quickly. And execution becomes paramount in making sure that you don't elongate your main programs and add risk where you can't afford it.
It ties into motivating the workforce to work hard, and there is a higher objective, which leads me to another question having to do what I would look at in terms of a marriage between the science that is the platform that you're pursuing and ultimate benefit to patients. So I wonder if you could speak a little about the science, just briefly, the science behind what Locus is trying to do and the ultimate desired benefit to patients. All of those things, both of those presumably helping drive employee motivation at Locus to really work hard and make it all happen. Can you talk a bit about the science and the patient benefit?
All of us that work in this industry, our industry was built on antibiotics. Antibiotics were the class of medicine that started pretty much every multinational pharma company that we know today. And they're essentially large molecule chemical compounds that are broad spectrum killing agents, right? They sort of indiscriminately kill large swaths of bacteria in the human body and are very effective at doing so, and have been the cornerstone of helping society to elongate life over the last, let's say, 70 years. And so where our, I think, needs come in now as society is those large molecules are beginning to see unprecedented levels of resistance. I think overuse of antibiotics, both in the field of medicine as well as expansion into industrial and agricultural use, have really now put a pretty large threat under pretty much every man, woman, and child on the planet, that one day when you need to clear a life-altering infection, that these drugs won't work. And so there's that side of it. I think for years we didn't study it in academia as the links between bacteria and disease. We didn't need to, because we had these broad spectrum killers. And now Locus is on what we think is the forefront of essentially selective removal of these pathogenic and pathobiont threats that are in the human body. So our technology is a gene therapy technology. It uses a bacteriophage viral vector to deliver a payload that's either an enzyme that drives programmed cell death and or a peptide that potentially drives an exogenous type of, I'll call it programmed cell death. The idea is that we would be able to systematically work with antibiotics initially, and then eventually replace antibiotics with a platform that essentially refreshes itself, much like a vaccine. And so if we're successful, the threat of MDR would be addressed, and our ability in medicine to reach into the human body and potentially remove bacteria that may be causing things like broad scale inflammation in the body for things like rheumatoid arthritis or ulcerative colitis, Crohn's disease, you name it. We would have a new tool in the medical arsenal to be able to address those threats. So we believe that's our compelling purpose, is to drive a change in the field of medicine in the next century and beyond.
And that it ties into patient benefit clearly. To be more specific, what is your first touchdown goal?
We just dosed patient 193 this week out of 288. We probably have another 9 months, maybe a little bit less, of dosing in front of us.
Which indication?
It's an acute urinary tract infection that's caused by AMR or MDR E. coli strains. And so we're going after a recurrent urinary tract infection population, of which we know 80% of those historically have been caused by E. coli. So it's been the perfect population to target to prove out that the platform works. But of course, we're in a 1-for-1 randomized double-blinded study. And we've been here for about 18 months, and we've got about 6 months left to go.
Based on what you said before about the science, you had a whole series of potential target indications that you could have pursued. Assuming your capital is not infinite, you had to make some decisions as to which scientific bets were worth funding early and which had to wait, even if they seemed compelling. So how did you decide on this indication and not 20 others?
Some of it's just the need to advance data at regular intervals in order to keep your dream alive. And then some of it is what you follow on in terms of additional programs and building out your pipeline. So usually when you're pulling a discovery out of academia like we did, your sponsor, your professor, the team of postdocs and PhD candidates that are advancing the technology, they're working on E. coli. And so E. coli as a product solution was just more advanced than anything else folks were working on. And in our particular example, I think that's broadening lately to other pathogenic threats. We knew we wanted to do something with E. coli. We knew we needed to do something that proved the technology. Urinary tract infections have the benefit of being able to get directly into the bladder through a catheter if necessary. And so we ran with that indication. And from there, we built out the portfolio with deals. We were really successful in early stage deals. We struck a huge $800 million deal with Johnson & Johnson in 2019. That was working on Pseudomonas and staph, both for lung and for systemic delivery for bacteremia. And so within maybe 2-3 years of starting the company, we had 3 assets that were really well funded, that were advancing towards the clinic, but E. coli was always in the front location. Unfortunately, Johnson & Johnson's infectious disease division did not survive, and so that division got shut down. But we actually, after about 22 months and a lot of work, were able to get both of those assets repartnered.
Paul, you talked about making deals with companies, and that takes us to fundraising and raising money to power your operation. And fundraising sometimes is described as storytelling under constraint. How did you prepare yourself personally to have conversations around raising capital? I'm assuming that at Patheon, you didn't have to do that. And so you had to maybe pick this up as a new skill when you founded Locus. Is that correct?
Yeah, I never had to raise small funds for smaller organizations. I mean, at Patheon, we certainly raised large rounds of debt to refinance certain acquisitions or M&A moves that we wanted to make. Fundraising is incredibly difficult unless you're actually being incubated and being brought in as an exec in residence from the bench of a funding entity that's making a run. The early stages of fundraising, the seed round for Locus, was actually not too difficult. We didn't raise a huge amount of money. 10 years ago, a seed round was usually pretty small, not like the seed rounds you hear about today.
Right.
And that was primarily industry contacts, friends, family, a typical type of round. We had a CRISPR component to our initial technology platform. It made raising pretty easy. And we got the money that we needed to get the first sets of in vivo data sets to be able to advance to a Series A. The Series A was very difficult. The Series A it took much longer than we had hoped, but our journey was, I think, unique. We did get some offers early. Not being in Boston, and I described that earlier, was a huge handicap. Getting around that took time to realize that we needed to go west. Once we started to bring in some big names from the West Coast, it became a domino effect, and things moved pretty quickly for us. We had a $5 million convertible note that led almost immediately to a Series A, led to an acquisition of one of our competitors, which led to the J&J deal. And by the time we were in years, sort of 3 and 4, I mean, we had 30 plus million in revenues, pretty outlandish, honestly, for any of the other, even biotechs we knew of, let alone anybody in infectious disease. And it was a good couple of years till COVID hit. And then I think we all had to deal with the realities of COVID.
Now, post-COVID, or in connection with COVID around 2022, there was a inflow of money into biotech, right? There was a spike. Did you benefit from that?
So Locus has been able to mobilize ballpark like $300 plus million at this point over the 10 years. So we've done exceptionally well. Only 55 million of that actually is dilutive. What we found post-COVID is the receptivity for non-dilutive deals, especially government deals, was in our favor.
Paul, looking back in the fundraising arena, would you admit to having made any mistakes that in retrospect have changed your approach to investors, or did everything go just as you wanted and it's all perfect?
Nothing has gone exactly as we have wanted. I think in the early days of starting the company, I believed that if we had stayed in an infectious disease, that we would be able to stay in stealth mode for a while without being really attacked, that people wouldn't come after our indications, that we wouldn't have any direct line competition, and it would give us the ability to get the technology advanced to the point where nobody else could catch us. So start from the niche of infectious disease and then break out to where we really saw the value. We've been huge believers that certain bacteria is not transient in the human body. And that non-transient bacteria that either engrafts somewhere that's bad or becomes intracellular that's bad, that existence inside the human body drives inflammation. And inflammation in the body, I think people are becoming acutely aware, does very bad things. And so had we had to do this all over, I probably would have put a lot more focus on immunology to get out of just infectious disease. That's where fundraising would have been easier. I think we would have probably also had a little bit easier of a time with the target. Getting something into the intestinal tract is very difficult. It's very difficult, but try getting something into the lower respiratory tract when a patient is incredibly sick. Try dealing with years or decades of biofilms that are maybe coating adherent invasive E. coli. And you got some very difficult targets in the chronic arena for infectious disease. And so I would have definitely expanded the platform, the portfolio mix, to be much more broader than just infectious disease. To attract the big money in private equity and venture capital, you need to have assets that have great commercial promise. We believe there is great commercial promise in infectious disease, but it's more like a vaccine, Alberto, with a lower product price, with a mass volume of sales. And that's a different mentality that not many in the field are used to investing in.
In January, you attended the 2026 JP Morgan Healthcare Conference in San Francisco, and you know better than I that at events like this, capital, partnerships, strategy converge very quickly. Sometimes these conversations happen in the hallways, Union Square, rooftop restaurants, maybe the bar. From your experience in 2026, what signals do you look for to decide whether a potential partner is truly resource optimizing or just maybe superficially attractive?
Lots of our industry is now moving to China. China has got amazing funding that's occurring. The Hong Kong markets are popping off IPOs. I think the speed at which the Chinese are developing drugs is really hurting Western countries at this point. And I think you could sense the flow of interest moving towards China. I think for us, that creates a difficult conundrum because we believe that the benefits that we're getting from the FDA are quite unique in the phage space. They're certainly quite unique in the unmet need arena in infectious disease. The ability for us to move fast with smaller patient populations is one that the FDA affords, but it's not the same across all industries. So for us, we need to stay rooted in the United States to stay close to our allies and supporters in Washington, D.C. We have to stay as far away from China as possible, which is difficult because that's where the money is. That's also where a huge amount of the MDR problem is. And so we're a little bit on the fence as to when we would maybe open up that push.
Paul, from your point of view, what makes an ideal partner for Locus?
So I have noticed a second trend actually in our industry, that deals are becoming much, much larger. When I started the company, $1 billion deal was not unheard of, but maybe a STEM-centric, maybe a Cubist, but they weren't the normal deal. The normal deals that pharma was pulling off were get to the end of a phase 2 proof of concept in human and flip your company. That, has given way to, I think, much larger deals. Post-COVID, there was a lot of investment in early stage and platform tech and filling out the lower levels of your pipeline. That's all gone now. You see pharmas basically buying revenue in as near a term a trajectory as they can get their hands on. Deal sizes are much bigger. There's still some potential high profile multi-billion-dollar failures that people are going to have, but strategics are trying to buy their way out of this patent cliff that's been coming forever. And so for Locus, we have to look to a different tier of partner that I think is much more aligned with us. Large volume sales at much more reasonable prices, competing on efficiencies in manufacturing and execution.
Paul, finally, on your decision making, again, aiming or speaking to scientists or executives preparing to become CEOs, what personal practices or decision making techniques have you found most helpful in your staying grounded when you have maybe capital pressure or scientific uncertainty or any other challenges? How do you make decisions? How do you stay grounded? Speak to the next generation of CEOs, Paul.
Well, I guess it is a much more difficult path than I thought that it would be. It takes a lot of grit. If you don't have experience working in sort of poor funding arenas, if you don't have experience in a multiplicity of functions in biopharma, you should really think about whether you're well set to do it. Because knowing a lot about one subject is probably not as impactful as you having sort of a reasonable depth of experience in all of the different functions that you're going to get called upon to really make decisions over. And I think, it's easy to be a leader when money's flowing and times are good. It's really hard to be a leader when money gets tight and teams get impatient and partners walk away. You have to be ready for a lot of no's. We got told no 73 times before we got our Series A, and that was back in the day where we had to go fly to get those no's. We've had $800 million contracts evaporate in front of our eyes for things that we didn't control. We've suffered lots of different setbacks, but simultaneously, we've focused, and it's been like this since the beginning, and this is probably my best piece of advice. If you don't know what it takes to get an IND approved or opened and or get a BLA or NDA approved, you probably shouldn't be in the seat, because so many people will throw you questions that are just delay tactics or hurdles that do not matter to the regulatory authorities, and you are wasting time and wasting money, and you will not get there. And so if you don't know that data experiment is just some young screener's stall tactic to potentially give you your chunk of, let's say, a Series B, you could go down that rabbit hole for 9 months to 12 months, go get a piece of data and come back, and the next senior person up that food chain hits you with another question. You can't get distracted by that. You can't waste your money. You can't waste your time. You won't make it. Know the data that you need before you get into the seat.
On that sound advice, Paul, we're going to conclude our conversation. That's it for this episode of Clinical Trialblazers. Thank you, Paul. Paul Garofolo, co-founder, CEO of Locus Biosciences, for sharing your perspective and your message of resilience, as I hear it, in your final advice to others. Folks, stay tuned for more episodes of Clinical Trialblazers, where we explore the human stories behind the ideas and innovations shaping biopharma and biotech. If you are enjoying the show, please take a moment to rate and review us wherever you listen. Clinical Trialblazers is created by Patheon Biotech and hosted by me, Alberto Grignolo, with production support from Acast Creative Studios. Thank you for listening, and until next time, stay curious and keep pushing the boundaries of clinical research.